Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome again to our session. If it's your first time joining us for this session, welcome to our virtual conference, a spotlight on emotional well-being, highlighting the past, present, and future. And again, welcome to our session. This is using acceptance and commitment training, ACT, to go from self-care to community care. We have with us Dr. Ahmad Zahir. Dr. Ahmad Zahir is an assistant professor of the school psychology in the Department of Psychology at St. John's University and co-founder of the Nurturing Environments Institute, the NEI. And Dr. Zahir is a pediatric school psychologist and has worked on numerous projects in clinics, hospitals, and public and alternative school settings that involve direct and indirect consultation, services across individual, group, and systems level. His research interests are in the application of implementation science towards creating and sustaining school prevention and intervention programs like school mental health, SEL, PBIS, and RTI within a multi-tiered systems of support MTSS framework with a particular focus of using third wave behavioral approaches as both a service delivery method and enhancing existing interventions. For his work in these areas, Dr. Zahir was awarded the Council for Exceptional Children CEC Professional Performance Award in 2019. Additionally, Dr. Zahir sits on the steering committee for the National Group Family School Community Alliance, the FSCA, which is an organization dedicated to creating robust collaboration and engagement across schools, families, community settings. And now at this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Zahir.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm going to start sharing my screen, but I wanted to put a link in the chat that I'll repost as well, which is for the slides. So if anyone's looking for them, you can find and download the slides there, as well as some resources that I'll mention at the very end. So I just wanted to give that to everybody here. And like I said, I'll post them again as the presentation goes on. But I'm very happy to be here and presenting on one of my favorite, or two favorite topics combined together, which is self-care and community care with acceptance commitment training. And so I'm going to jump straight in because we don't have a lot of time. So I know people are still coming in, but I want to make sure that we are able to get through the content and then also hopefully have some time for Q&A and interactions. So because of the time limitation, this will be a little bit more of an overview. I think if we had a little bit more time, I'd love to do a kind of an interactive exercise. So I want to make sure that I can at least give you a broad overview of how we can use ACT for going from self-care to community care and really actually being able to do a little bit of both. So I always like to show this graphic I found online a while ago. And we're in September right now. And in some ways, our trajectory as we start the school year or are going back to work tends to be very predictable, right? So we know roughly what we're going to end up like in November. Some of us may already be in November, right? Depending on how tough your environment is. And in some ways, I think this is kind of an inevitability, right? We know that no matter how hard we try, no matter how many mindfulness retreats we go to over the summer, we're still going to have some of these challenges. And it almost seems like what actually a lot of my colleagues often tell me, they come back from vacation and day one, all the stress is just right back there. And it feels like it almost negated all the good work that was done on a vacation or the self-care journey. So in some sense, today's presentation is a little bit of how can we start to change this inevitability of how we move through our year and end up becoming stressed and even in some extreme cases burnout. So as the title implies, I will be talking to you about acceptance and commitment training, which actually started off as a therapy. So it's also called acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's great that you had a DBT session right before this. I don't know if everybody attended that, but they're very, very close siblings in terms of how they approach doing work for psychological help. So just to give you an overview of ACT in a very elevator speech way, ACT really tries to focus on changing the way we relate to our own experiences to make ourselves more flexible. And this is different from traditional approaches where we might try to change our experiences, right? So in more traditional therapy, we might try to change how we're feeling. We might try to change how we're thinking. In ACT, it's not necessarily trying to change those things. It's trying to relate differently when those feelings and thoughts show up in a way that allows us to remain flexible. And that's the acceptance piece. The commitment piece then is, once we start to relate differently, is how can we take action towards the things that are going to be important for us in life. And that's a little bit more of that commitment piece, right? What are we committing to once we have mastered that acceptance skill? And then finally, it is a practice. So the training piece really highlights the fact that this is, in some sense, not something you can know. That's one of the limitations of today. I'm going to tell you information about it, but it's really ultimately a practice. So I always say it's very much like stretching, right? So the more you stretch, the more flexible you become. But if you haven't stretched in a few years, you're going to have to go back to your stretching practice. So the main focus for today actually is to show you one of these practices that you can take away and do for free on your own, as well as maybe something you want to take back to your communities and try to establish some of those community care initiatives. So I'm going to come back to ACT, but I want to actually transition first to discussing, staying with ACT a little bit, but discussing a concept that you probably, again, if you were in the DBT session, learned about, is the dialectic, which is basically how do we balance things that seemingly appear to be opposites, right? So the acceptance and commitment therapy often embodies this as well, where we're often between trying to change ourselves, right? Better ourselves, do these change strategies, and at the same time trying to accept ourselves for how we are and what we're experiencing. And this could seem contradictory, but in a dialectic, these can be balanced, where we can actually learn to accept ourselves and then also use that level of acceptance and self-compassion to also incorporate change strategies. So in most situations, we need some healthy balance of the two. So I'm going to borrow this concept from DBT, which is also found in ACT, and talk about the dialectic for burnout or stress or feeling overwhelmed, between self-care, which I think we're all familiar with, right? A lot of our strategies that were often recommended for stress and burnout, as well as community care, right? So how do we do the other care or have organizations, sometimes systems or organization care that allow us to be better off, not necessarily just based on our ability to do self-care. And again, this is not a either or kind of choice, right? It's a dialectic where it might seem contradictory, right? A lot of times people often say, do we change ourselves or do we change society? And I think the answer is both, right? We have to be able to work on both ends of it, but we have to be careful about how we approach this. So now I'm going to transition a little bit, and we'll come back to the strategies in ACT. But I'm going to show this dialectic play out in the area of burnout, where we see this happen over and over again, where burnout is typically defined as a response to chronic job stressors, right? So a feeling of exhaustion, having negative hostile responses to work conditions, right? Becoming cynical over time. And then also having a negative sense of self, right? So it's not just becoming cynical about the work, but also feeling bad about ourselves, right? Maybe I'm just not good enough. And that's oftentimes a very, very common part of the experience of really thinking that you can't move forward. Unfortunately, with burnout, this tends to be the most common way we conceptualize it, very much focused on the individual, right? The individual is becoming cynical. The individual has the lack of self-efficacy. And we also start to see this even in how we approach our strategies, right? If a person's exhausted, right? This is where we often get those recommendations of go on vacation. And maybe the vacation will help with that, but it's not necessarily going to last once we come back if the environment is still the same situation that we found ourselves in. And interestingly enough, when we look at the research on burnout, that's not necessarily the focus, right? So the focus on burnout research tends to be a lot more on looking at the workplace and not necessarily the people. Christina Maslach is one of the leading experts in burnout, and in fact, the three-part categories was also part of her work. But she's very, very clear that these are not meant to be categories that we then use to change people, but more to change the workplaces themselves. So she has a wonderful analogy in one of her articles where she talks about the canary in the coal mine, where she asks us to picture a canary in a coal mine who's singing and happy, and then all of a sudden they stop singing, and when we come to find them covered in soot and disease, they're no longer singing, right? We want to ask ourselves what made the canary sick. But in our situations with burnout, we often don't necessarily ask that same question of what was making the individual sick. We often pose the question of how does the individual improve themselves. So just like the canary in the mine is telling us there's not something wrong with the canary, but there's something wrong with the coal mine. Right, there's too much soot or other dangerous environments. We want to make sure that we're asking the same question for ourselves in terms of what does the environment look like that's causing some of this burnout. So she also goes on to say that this is not in any ways to put down a lot of our strategies that we do use for self-care. So having optimism, gratitude, hope, these are oftentimes really, really important things. But again, we also want to ask the further question of why is this happening in the first place, right? What's the source of the burnout, and not necessarily what individuals can do to help with their own self-care. So doing all the stuff that we often recommend without that bigger picture can often be something that can even be harmful, right? So if we're recommending grit and yoga classes and mindfulness courses, all things that I personally love and do, it can often be very harmful if it doesn't actually help the individuals be able to get to getting over burnout or severe stress. So we really want to make sure that we're looking at that broader environment piece. I often find a lot of these cartoons online that kind of communicate that same message, where oftentimes even the most well-intentioned messages, right? So focusing on positive in the situation is generally good advice, but given the right context, it can be really seen as aversive, right? So we probably want to help this person out of the water, and then maybe focus on the positive, right? That they almost drowned, but not fully, and they were saved. So we really want to again make sure that we're being careful at how we're presenting this information to individuals when they're experiencing stress and burnout. And there's even good research reasons to think about this broader context. So generally, we think that these individual strategies, whether it's your own personal self-care or even therapy, are very, very effective. And there's research to show that when we look at teachers in this case, when we do individual interventions like individual therapy, the interventions themselves have a very small effect. Which means that they're effective, but they're not necessarily very effective, right? So they do have some impact, but they're not necessarily going to give us that big impact that we're looking for. And then we also realize that it doesn't actually impact all areas of burnout either. So while it helps with emotional exhaustion and personal accomplishments, it doesn't address things like depersonalization that a lot of people with burnout experience as well. So again, there's inherent limitations on how much we can do, even if we're seeking therapy, right? So that's even going beyond self-care. It's actually getting professional help from other individuals, which works. And again, as a psychologist myself, I would always recommend for those that might be struggling. But we again want to look at the limitations of that approach. And again, just some cartoons to communicate the same message, right? A lot of times, a situation where we are offering therapy are situations where we could actually legitimately help the person out of that situation, right? So in this cartoon, we probably, again, therapy may not be harmful here, but we could probably actually fly that person off the island. And that's really kind of where we want to look at in terms of our broader community care. So another thing that I like to mention as we talk about this topic is really thinking about what kinds of stress we're also dealing with, which also oftentimes tell us what kinds of strategies we want to use. So some kinds of stress can be good in the sense that we can overcome them, but others can be fairly crippling, right? So we can try as hard as we can, and it's not necessarily going to work for us. So we often divide these into challenge stress versus hindrance stress, where the challenge stress is like trying to get a ball over a tennis net, right? If we really commit ourselves to doing this, maybe we practice a lot, we can actually do this, right? We can hit the ball over the net, and we can get better and better at it. So challenge stress is really helpful in these situations where it's actually something we can build and grow into. And a lot of things in our workplaces often are like that, right? We can overcome the stress by learning new skills. If you're in schools, oftentimes the stress is student behavior. And we can learn really, really good strategies for how we address those student behaviors in a positive way that will help with our stress. However, we also have hindrance stress. And I grew up in New York City, so we had these walls everywhere for handball. But if we're playing tennis against the wall, hindrance stress is the type of stress that it doesn't matter how much effort you put into it, it's not necessarily going to change by your individual efforts. So no amount of actions here are going to help you beat the wall, right? The wall always wins. So we want to, again, just be careful about how we separate these two things out, and recognize that not everything in life that gives us lemons can be made into lemonade. And I particularly love this picture because I always think that when we were thinking about the lemonade being made, we're thinking about like one or two lemons, as opposed to what a lot of us experience is thousands of lemons coming at us in all directions. So again, this is where we want to think about what are some things broader than our individual strategies we can use. So when we think about that challenge stress, again, this is where we can do a lot of our traditional coping strategies. Let's get stronger. But when we think about what do we do for the hindrance stress, this is where we really want to think about more systems change, right? So we could break the wall, we could break down the system, and that's certainly an option. But we can also think about what kinds of supports we can garner up within our community to make the system better, right? So we have some options here on those strategies. So coping strategies, I'm not going to list the majority of them that are out there. There really could be anything that really helps you cope or helps you build resilience, right? So whether it's self-care or various wellness strategies or even going on vacation are wonderful for that individual level. On the prevention systems change side, though, this is kind of the area that we are often under-focused on. This is where we want to try to create more nurturing and supporting environments, create better work conditions, and also psychological enhancements for work conditions, where we might not be able to change the environment, but can we improve it in the sense of psychological enhancements? And fortunately, the burnout literature actually gives us this, right? So the literature on burnout, including Christina Maslach's work, talks about what are the systems level changes we can make. And the most obvious one, obviously, is to reduce the workload, right? So that's really a very common place where we see burnout and stress is we're overloaded. And surprisingly, though, there's at least 5 other areas that we can focus on. One of them is choice, right? So how much choice do we have in the work we do as well as the way we do our work? Recognition systems, right? So not just pay, but also social rewards, right? Are you recognized for putting in extra work or going the extra mile, or is it something that's just largely avoided? How's your community, right? So especially thinking about that community care piece, are you in a nurturing group that support each other or in a more socially toxic environment? Fairness, right? So how fair are the systems in the area that you're working in, right? Are people rewarded for the hard work that they're doing, or do some people disproportionately get more rewards, or do some people not get punished for doing certain things that other people get punished for? And fairness, we found, is a big piece in this process. And then finally, values. So how we find meaning in our work, right? So our meaning of the work that we're doing can be a key piece as well. So in mental health and education, oftentimes this is something that we have in spades, but can lose track of it if we're really, really stressed out and burnt out as an organization. So this could also be something that we can do as a lever we can press to make some of these systems change happen. And the exciting thing about this list that I always found was that workload is the biggest thing that we tend to focus on, and it's also the hardest to change, right? It might just be the nature of the setting we're working in, right? We have 50 clients, or we have new students coming in, and we have oversized classrooms. But we can also, for the rest of these, focus on these regardless of what the situation is, and it's a lot easier to do the other 5 than to reduce the workload. Ultimately, I think we need to reduce the workload, but it at least gives us additional options of how we get there. And fortunately, there's research on this. So again, I'm not going to go through this, but there's actually research showing that organizational interventions to change climate and culture are really, really helpful for burnout and stress, and really looking at that broader piece of how we help individuals. The interesting thing about this research is that it also shows that it improves individual self-care. If we do the organizational piece, individuals are better at then taking care of themselves as well. So if we think about these 2 different strategies, I've already mentioned this at the beginning, right? Which one do we do? I always like to do both, right? So why choose one or the other? But I do prioritize the systems change in terms of long-term goals, right? So I always love this Edward Deming quote, bad system always beats a good person every time. And that always sticks with me because I always think of it as a matter of time, right? If you're very, very resilient, you're tough as nails, and you can really take on a lot of stress, you might last longer, but it's going to be something that eventually will catch up to you in terms of feeling overwhelmed or stressed or even burnt out. So we really want to make sure as a long-term priority, we are working towards that community care and organizational change. But paradoxically, we often have to start off with our individual selves, right? How do we start in terms of changing how we're doing so that we can even do some of the bigger work in terms of changing our systems. Uh, and this is where we bring ACT back in, right? So I kind of took a roundabout road here, but ACT in some ways is a therapy. So again, it does the traditional work of doing therapy for individuals that are burnt out, but it also can be focused on systems change. So in some ways, it allows us to do both, right? So individually, it's really looking to build that flexibility I mentioned earlier, right? How do you become more flexible with your experiences? But as a group, there's protocols out there that also look to see how do we build more psychological safety as a group, right? How do we feel more safe and comfortable and cooperative amongst each other so that we can work towards some of those bigger changes? And the to show you how to do this, and again, we have limited time, so I'm going to show you in a very quick way on how you could potentially do this. I'm going to use a tool called the ACT Matrix, which is really just one way of doing ACT training, but it's nice because it actually allows us to do both levels, right? So I'll show you how to do it as in individuals, things you can take away and try on your own later today. But then also as you become more flexible, or if you work with others at your workplace to become more flexible, how you can also start to work towards creating that psychological safety for your group as a whole, towards that community care piece. All right, so I'm gonna move through these in step. So I'll go through the two different loops of creating flexibility and safety. And then I'm also going to end with covering core design principles, which is also just making sure that as we do the work at the group level, that even that process itself is conducive for good community care, right? So for a team working at a school, we want to make sure that the teaming process itself is not burning us out. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can incorporate the same strategies even in the work that we're doing. So starting off at the individual level, the ACT matrix is tends to be a visual exercise. So it does require either paper or pencil or some kind of a screen in this situation. And what we want to do is use this diagram that we have here, one line going down and then a line going across with arrows, to notice and sort our experiences. So the first thing I always put on this diagram, and you could do this if you wanted to in front of you on a piece of paper, is notice what we're experiencing, right? So this is a mindfulness component of ACT, where we want to increase our self-awareness and notice what's happening both externally as well as internally. So one of the first things that we'll do is think about our five senses. That's going to really cue us into our outside view, right? So what are the worlds of our actions, things that we can see ourselves and other people doing? And again, we want to just notice what that looks like, right? So what are we noticing right now with our five senses, right? We might be seeing things, hearing things, smelling things. If we've had lunch recently, we might be tasting things. And again, we just want to take notice of what that's like right now for us. On the other side of this, we also want to think about what's happening for us internally within our mind, right? So this will be our inside view, right? So the world of our mind, what are the things that we're feeling, thinking, maybe sensations that we're having, right? It's been a long day of conference, so you might be pretty tired, so you might be feeling fatigued right now. And the main thing that we want to do here is just notice the difference, right? Well, how does it feel different when we're noticing things with our five senses versus when we're noticing things with our mind? And once we've done that, we want to help notice one additional distinction, and that's going to be now going from left to right. And this on one side, I'm going to put the word away. And this is for our experiences of things that we want to move away from, right? So if you have a task that you really, really don't want to do, you might be looking to finish it so you can put it behind you. Or you might be really looking for the workday to be over so you can go do other things that might be more enjoyable for you. So it could be anything that we want to try to move away from or get away from. On the other side, we're going to put the word towards. And this is for our experiences for things that we want to move towards, right? Things that we want to come closer to, right? So we might all be looking forward to the weekend. I know I am, and maybe enjoy the last few warm days outside. But it could be, again, any number of things that you can think about that you might want to move towards, right? Maybe you're going to have a really good dinner tonight and then you're looking forward to it, or meeting up with friends and family and you might be looking towards meeting those individuals. And just like the other distinction between our five senses and our mind, we just want to notice the difference of how it feels when we're trying to move away from something, and also when we're trying to move towards something. And once we've done this, this is where we can start our exercise. So the exercise itself starts by helping individuals make those distinctions, right? So our outside world, our inside world, how we're moving away or towards things. And once we've set that up, now we can actually start to use this diagram to sort our experiences. And we do this by asking some questions, right? So we might ask ourselves who or what's important to us, right? Or what are our values? So what are some things deep down that we really, really find important that we want to move towards? And here, I'm just going to put some answers. Again, if we had more time, I'd actually have you write out your answers. Feel free to put these in the chat if you want to, as I'm going through this. But, if I was doing this, I would put things like family, integrity, children and students, maybe justice or health, things that might be important to me, right? People and things that are important to me. And this is going to be on the bottom side of the diagram because this is internal to me, right? You can't look at me walking down the street and know that I really care about family. This is something that I can tell you, or you can explore with me to figure out what's important to me. On the other side, we also want to ask kind of the question of what are stuff that shows up internally for us, so staying within the mind, things like thoughts, feelings, and memories that move us away from these values, right? So we might all share some value of family or friends or people that we care about, but oftentimes we have anxiety or stress or being overwhelmed, feeling numb in different situations, pain, maybe even having certain thoughts, right? I'm not good enough. I should be doing more, right? Maybe memories of past conflicts that we've had. And all of these things could, if they're happening pretty intensely or often, move us away from these things that are important, right? So if I'm feeling very anxious, I might pass on a family event, even though I really value my family and want to see them. So once we've asked those two questions, now we can move on top of our diagram. So staying on the left side of things that are moving us away, we can now ask the question on our outside view of what are some behaviors that we find ourselves engaging in that move us away from our values. And here we can think of any number of behaviors, right? These are going to be very specific to you. I always like to put my number one there for Netflix for avoiding things that I should be doing. And you can add in your own streaming services of Hulu and whatever else you watch. But we can think of all different ways people might move away from things that are important to them, right? We can do drugs, we can argue, we can isolate ourselves, we can overwork. So any of these actions that are going to move you personally away from those things that are important to you. And that's a part that I want to emphasize, even though I know I'm moving pretty quickly through this, is that all of this is individualized to you, right? So because I value these things doesn't mean that you value those things, right? So you might have different values. And as a result, different things are going to show up for you internally and externally that are going to move you away from those values. And then our final question here is going to be, what are some behaviors we engage in that move us towards our values, right? So if we are trying to move towards all these things, of family, integrity, children, justice, and health, what are some actions we can do for that? And again, this will also vary based on your individual preferences. So again, I just put some answers over here, right? Maybe I'm going to set some time and prioritize family and loved ones. I'm going to set limits. I'm going to say no more often. I'm going to, maybe engage in professional development. I'm going to advocate for myself and others. And I'm going to engage in some, outdoor exercises, hiking, running, biking. So you can fill in again your blanks in there in terms of what you would do. And that's the first step of doing the ACT matrix, right? Again, we set up the distinctions and now we write out our experience, right? Really noticing what's showing up for us as we ask and answer these questions. And you can do that for yourself, right? Either right now or later. Think about what are some things that you would fill in here as you're going through this. And if we do this long enough, if we develop that muscle of building our awareness of all these questions, what we notice over time is that certain patterns start to emerge. So in this case, we might notice that there's certain places where we might be getting stuck. Right. So I might start having the thought that I should be doing more, as I often do. And as a result, I tend to overwork, right? And if I'm overworking, it often tends to impact my health, my ability to see my family. But I find myself regularly trapped in this cycle, right, of having this thought and overworking. And there's never enough, right? I can work all day, all night, and there's still more work to be done. So our goal here is to not only sort our experience overall, but then start to notice, are there places where we're getting stuck between our internal experience that might lead to our external experience. And once we do that, this is where we start to use some of our ACT strategies to become mindfully aware of that we're having this thought, and this tends to hook us into doing more work and make a shift, right? So if we notice that we're having this thought and it tends to lead us to overworking, right? Using a mindfulness strategy to bring ourselves in the moment, right? And that what could be something as simple as taking a deep breath, and then committing yourself to doing something different, right? So I should be doing more work, and I'm going to set a limit and say no, right? Or I'm going to have a plan for how many things I'm willing to do, right? Maybe I only spend 8 hours working and then I stop. And maybe this is connected to my value of health, right? So I'm overworking, I'm stressed, I'm losing sleep. So I can also connect with my value of health and recognize that even if I feel the urge to do more work, this is more aligned with my values and it's going to help me move towards that. Um, so that's largely what the ACT matrix does for individuals. It can seem very simple, so it's always helpful to when you actually use it for yourself to get that experience. And the main focus really is to raise your awareness of your own experiences. And again, over time, look to see where you're getting stuck personally and how once you've taken notice of where you're getting stuck, start using strategies to move yourself towards your values. There's numerous amounts of strategies you can use to do that. Mindfulness is one of them that can help you become more flexible, but also skill building, right? Maybe there's skills that you need to do some of these actions to move towards your values, right? So you can pursue learning those skills as well. So whatever that is for you individually, that would be the goal as you're doing the ACT matrix. So just very quick review. Again, we start off with the ACT matrix. We ask our 4 questions. And in some ways, this is sorting our experiences, right? We're becoming aware of them and we're sorting our experiences using this diagram. Over time, based on the values that we hold, we might notice that there's certain cycles we're getting stuck in. So the second task is identifying where we're getting stuck, right? And this, again, if you do the exercise long enough, can come up pretty naturally for you. And then we end with looking to see how do we get unstuck, right? So noticing that stress and anxiety, and then doing things that are going to be important for us that align with our values. So that's the overall focus of the ACT matrix. It's simple in what it does, but it can be pretty difficult to put it into action in our personal life. So again, it is a practice, right? So it's something we want to do over and over again, and get better and better at it. There's different strategies also. I would say if you're more concrete as an individual, you can certainly turn this into more of a concrete activity of goal setting and writing in answers. So, you can ask yourself, how do I remind myself of my values? That often is a good strategy, right? So if you're starting off your day, start it off with actually reminding yourself of what are the core values that you have, right? What are the things that you really want to focus on? You can become more aware of your thoughts and emotions as they're coming up to catch yourself, maybe getting started in that cycle. So you can do thoughts and emotion journals. And then you can also look at maybe away moves or toward moves, and the away side things you might want to reduce, and then toward moves you might want to increase, and set some goals for that. I've listed out 5, but I almost always do 1 because 5 is too much. But again, if you're more concrete and you want like very specific steps, once you've done the matrix, you can often use something like this to help yourself. You can also just use this in your mind, right? So a lot of times if I'm running around, I often close my eyes, take a deep breath, bring my values to my mind, compassionately accept whatever is showing up, right? If I'm anxious before I go into a big meeting, whatever that is, accepting whatever internal content is showing up for me. Um, Looking to be aware of or noticing any unhelpful actions I'm engaging in or will engage in, and then committing myself and trying to shift towards those actions that are going to be important for me. So this is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum where it's very abstract. But if you hate worksheets and goal setting, this could be something where you do again before you start your workday or something stressful. Some important caveats before we move on to, again, how we do this work in community care. I always like to just mention that as we do this activity, and especially when we're really stressed out and we're trying to get a lot done, it's very, very easy to use good strategies to become harsher with ourselves. So I always say that when we're doing the ACT matrix, we really want to make sure that we're doing this with a healthy dose of self-compassion, right? So when we talk about away moves, it can be seen as a failure, right? I committed to doing X and I didn't do that. In fact, I did something that moved me away from the thing that I was trying to do. But we want to recognize that sometimes that's very much needed, right? So when COVID hit, a lot of us had to engage in a lot more relief moves because things were very stressful and we needed more relief than we might typically need. And long term, of course, we want to try to move towards our values and have that greater satisfaction and contentment. But again, understanding that this is a little bit based on our situation and how things change in our lives. So I always say that if you are really really stressed out or going through something intense at the moment, again think about what's the right balance for you, right? So you might have a normal balance if you're really really good at this to have a 80% moving towards and 20% moving away. But if you're going through a particularly stressful time, that might change down to 70 and 30 or even 60 and 40. So again, it's not really meant to be used as a tool to get a lot more, shame and self-blame, but really using it as a way to understand what you need and being able to again sort your experiences and become more flexible in how you're approaching these situations. So I would like to throw that in there because again, it's very very easy for all of us to kind of slip back into it, and in some ways this becomes an additional task that we're trying to achieve, right? So it's really more about setting that balance. Personal example of this, 5.5 months ago, I had my first child, a baby daughter. And I can tell you almost immediately all my wonderful self-care strategies went out the window. And I engaged in a lot of relief moves, mainly by eating really bad food, and resting and doing all kinds of other things that I normally wouldn't do. And again, that to me is still very much aligned with this model, right? I'm shifting my actions based on what I need in that moment, right? That's not necessarily always going to be the case, but it's something that's needed at the current moment. Okay, so this brings us to how we do our group version of this, right? So we've developed an individual flexibility. Our next step really here becomes how do we do this as a group? How do we get that bigger change happening? When we're thinking about our hindrance stress, right? The things that we individually are not able to overcome. And again, fortunately, the ACT matrix allows us to do the same work with the groups as it does for individuals. So you notice in the middle circle here in the group matrix, we change the term me noticing to us noticing. And as you may guess, now the activities have shifted only in the sense of we're now doing it as a group, right? So instead of saying, what do I value or what do I find important, we can sit down with our work group or teams or classrooms and ask ourselves, what do we value as a group or as a team or as a family? I always put families in there because I've done a lot of these workshops, usually for school professionals, and the vast majority of it tell them that they never use them at school, but they ended up using it at home. So, family certainly counts as a group. So it could also be done, in the personal context as well. But again, we can generate a list of what's important to us as part of our group membership. We can also ask the questions of what gets us stuck, right? What are some internal experiences that we might share that show up for us that move us away, as well as what are some actions that we notice ourselves doing, right? So maybe we're burnt out and becoming more cynical, and we notice that more and more of us are starting to come in late, right? That's something I've noticed myself when in situations where I've felt burned out, right? I start to lose track of a lot of the deadlines and coming in late. So we can talk about this as a group, right? What are some things that are getting us stuck as a group that are going to help us move forward? This is also an area why it's important to start as individuals because developing that flexibility individually is really, really important to have this conversation in an honest way, right? So if I'm going to mention something, an action that I notice we're doing as a group that is not helpful for us, uh, I have to expect some pushback and maybe even some anger from those people that I'm working with. So having that flexibility to deal with some discomfort is going to be really, really important for all of us if we do this activity as a group. And again, our goal here is the same, right? Once we start to notice this, where we're getting stuck, is how do we make that shift then over to actions that are going to move us towards our shared values and goals. So we are starting off with the flexibility, but then we also want to move that to the safety as a group. And then really be comfortable with sharing uncomfortable things, right? How do we make sure that we actually have a way to be able to bring up those uncomfortable topics so we're not hiding it or not necessarily sharing that out? I've developed over time some strategies for this because it's very hard to do, even if we are more flexible. So sometimes I'll even survey people and say, how many things did you want to bring up that you didn't feel comfortable bringing up? And I don't want to know what those things are. I don't even want to know who you are, right? I just want to know as a group, are there people in my group that don't feel comfortable bringing up certain things? And if that's the case, we can target that, right? That means that we haven't developed enough flexibility and safety as a group. And let's just focus on that first before we get to content and other actions that we might want to do in terms of moving towards our values. So this is kind of the work that we can, again, use the same thing we're doing, act with individuals, with ourselves, but then scale it up to our groups. This is also an area where we can bring back some of the work I showed you earlier, right? So thinking about the work of systems change for burnout, right? The 6 areas of workload, enhanced choice, recognition, positive communities, fairness, and values are now things we can think about as a group, right? What are some things that we can do to reduce the workload, right? Maybe we add employees. We can ask or add more choices. We can be more flexible on how we offer those choices. We can add in more social recognition, creating more positive culture and social community. That's really kind of the heart of the community care, right? It's, you might be in a very tough job, but do people support you, and are the people around you really helping you out as you go through? Again, ensuring fairness. That's pretty much a human universal. No one likes unfairness. And then values, right? Again, making sure that we connect to these. I'm pretty sure that most of us in the field have a very good sense of what we value, but again, it can really get hard to remember what those are in those really, really hard moments. So as an organization, how can we put to get forward our work on our values? So we put this back on the ACT matrix, right? This could be part of our actions that we're going to take, right? So are we going to reduce certain things or increase certain things? That's going to be part of our group matrix conversation, right? So maybe we decide that the community aspect, right, is really become a toxic environment. So what can we do to improve that toxicity, right? So there's a lot of different ways we can go about that. Maybe setting better cultural norms in our organization, different ways of interacting with each other if we have conflicts, right? Let's put down some strategies for that. And then also, what can we increase, right? So ideally, again, we would like to make sure we decrease workload and maybe increase the number of employees. But if we don't have that option, at least not immediately, can we do stuff that is often doable in almost any situation, right? Can we increase the choices that we have, so we have more autonomy in the work that we're doing? And we can go through all the other 4 areas as well, all right, and think about how we can enhance our organization and our community by increasing these things. All right, so final thing that I want to mention to you, as I mentioned earlier, is the core design principles. And this is really just looking to make sure that, again, as we work as a group and as a team, that this is not another source of burnout, right? So it's kind of similar to the having a lot of compassion for yourself as individuals. We really, really want to make sure that when we're doing this group work, that it's done well, right? And it's done with all the same things that we're looking for when we're doing the work for other people, but apply to ourselves as a team or as a group. And this work, just as a quick citation, it comes from the work of Eleanor Ostrom, who is not in the field of mental health, but she passed, was a Nobel Prize winning economist. And her work is really, really fascinating because she traveled around the world, studying all different types of groups, from corporations to villager to farmers, around issues where they had to share common resources, right? So work environments are a good example of this, but really any community that has resources that they share. And what she found was that whenever these groups were successful, they had these core design principles in common, right? So it didn't matter which group it was across the whole world, which country, which culture they were in. All those groups had these 8 core principles present for them to be successful. And so the ACT researchers noticed her work and incorporated it into their protocols called pro-social, which is basically the group matrix. So you can see here the core design principles that Eleanor Ostrom has, and you can see how you can probably see how it fits very nicely onto the matrix work that we've been thinking about, as well as some of the burnout factors, right? So, and none of these should surprise you, right? So, thinking about any group that you've ever worked in, right, having a group identity and sense of purpose, that's going to get at the value piece. Fair distribution of costs and benefits, fair inclusion and inclusive decision making, right? Really looking at that fairness piece, monitoring agreed upon behavior, graduated sanctions for misbehavior, fast and fair conflict resolution, authority to self-govern, getting at choice, and then even appropriate relationships with other groups, right? So how do we interact with the outside systems as well? So simple principles, but again, this is why Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize, because she showed that this was almost a human universal. It didn't matter where you were in the world, what you were doing. If your group has these 8 things, you're going to be successful, or you have a very high chance of being successful. So when we go back to the matrix, when we're doing this as a group, we really take these into account, right? So when we think about our values, right, this is where we develop our group identity and purpose. When we think about actions that are going to help us, that are aligned with our values, right, these are what are the actions that align, and also how do we monitor progress towards those actions. We also want to make sure that we have a plan for when we are taking actions that are not moving us towards, but moving us away, right? And how do we address some of those conflicts, right? And maybe even hurt feelings, right? Some conflicts and feelings of unfairness that might show up as a group, right? So where we're getting stuck in terms of our actions as well as our feelings. So using these core design principles becomes again a central focus of the group matrix as we're doing some aspects of developing that community care and changing our system to be healthier and better able to take care of individuals. Fortunately, there's also a lot of tools related to this. So there's actually a lot of great surveys and tools that we can use to even measure for our team or our organization as a whole, how much do we feel that we're living up to these principles that Eleanor Ostrom came up with. Go back here for all 8 of them. So are we doing all of these things in our group and our organization? And unsurprisingly, these measures are very strongly correlated with stress and well-being of individuals that we work with. So I have one pictured here, and this is actually a good opportunity for me to repost the link that I posted earlier for the resources. So if you follow that Google link, it will actually take you into this folder where not only can you find the PowerPoints for today, if you go into the resource folder and click on the pro-social measure, you can see this measure over here that asks questions. And again, this is something you could use for your team, your group, and your family if you want to, where you can assess how much of a shared identity and purpose you have. How much does your group feel committed to each other, right? How much cooperation is there among your group? How much psychological needs are satisfied, right? At the group satisfaction level as well as on the individual level. And then also how much trust is there in the group, right? That kind of gets to that psychological safety piece, right? Do I feel safe and do I trust the people I'm working with in this situation? There's also other fun tools here that I didn't necessarily mention. There's actually a manual. It's an old manual for how to do pro-social. So if you're really interested in facilitating this is free. There's actually a book you can buy for this that's more up to date, but if you wanted to use the free resource to get started. And then there's also even measures. This is one of my favorites, is a measure for looking at our meetings, right? So meetings tend to be a big source of stress for a lot of us. We usually have a lot of them. Sometimes they're not fun meetings. And this measure actually looks at how much of our meetings are being done successfully, right? Are we getting interrupted very often? Are people harshly criticizing or blaming each other? And then we can assess our interactions and put that back on the matrix to see how effective we're being in terms of the work that we're doing. Okay, so I'm surprised, and I went a little bit fast, but I made it to the end with time to spare, so we can hopefully answer some questions and get some interaction. But thank you for sticking with me. I know that's a lot of information thrown your way, but I'm happy to answer questions or even share resources with you, even beyond the ones that I've given you, if you wanted to try out ACT for yourself, or again, for thinking about that community care piece. So thank you so much. And like I said, I'm happy to take any questions. I haven't been monitoring the chat, so I will just take a look to see if there's anything in there.
Thank you, Dr. Zahir. I
Yeah.
am also checking the chat as well as a Q&A to see if there's any questions.
It's a long day, so people might be looking to do
Here's,
some toward moves towards other things right now.
here's a question that it just came to my mind. How can ACT be integrated into leadership development programs? I was wondering if you had any experience with that.
Yeah, so actually the group matrix usually started off with working with leadership teams rather than individual, like the whole group, because It's very hard depending on the size of your group, right? You might be in a whole school district, so you're not going to bring everybody in the whole school district together, but we can bring together the district leadership and have them do that work. So a lot of times it actually is more focused on the leaders rather than the whole group as a whole, or we start with the leaders and then we move to everybody else in that situation. On the individual level, if you're a leader yourself and you're just looking to do this work, if you're again a principal and you want to improve your leadership, I would say you can start with just doing the individual psychological flexibility piece, right? So much of leadership focuses on not getting defensive when people that are working under us bring up criticism, right? And maybe they're looking for help, and if we're unable to remain flexible with some of those experiences coming in, we probably are going to do things that contradict our own values as leaders, right? I want to be a very supportive leader, but if I shut down a conversation that criticizes my leadership, right, that's going to actually work against me. But understandable, right? We're all human. None of us want to hear criticisms, right? We want to hear positives. So becoming more flexible allows me to hold space as a leader to really hear maybe even the unhappy thoughts that people might have with me. So I think at the individual level, you can do that. I always encourage group leadership. So if you're comfortable and you have the ability to do it, I would say also do the group matrix with your leadership team as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, I just want to thank you for such an informative webinars and conference session. We will, of course, share the recording of this session on the conference website along with the link to your slides. And it'll also be posted on our conference website.
Wonderful. I saw people asking for
Yes.
email.
Okay. So I will also share your email as well if they have any questions. And again, I
Yep.
want to thank you all
It's
for
also down there if anybody needs it. So
wonderful. I just want to thank everyone for attending this session, and thank you so much for your encouraging feedback. I'm reading all the comments right now. And our next session will be our closing remarks. If you could please join from the VFairs platform, the link to join will be embedded there. And again, thank you, Dr. Zahir, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day.
okay, thank you for having me. Have a good one.